The 9/11 Commission, chartered at the end of November 2002, they wrapped up their investigation less than 2 years later, at the end of August 2004. 10-member committee, appointed by President Bush, half Democrat, half Republican. The chairman, Thomas Kean, Republican. Co-chairman, Lee Hamilton, Democrat. Some of the more notable names among the commissioners was Richard Benveniste, one of the Watergate prosecutors, and John Lehman. John Lehman was Secretary of the Navy during the 1980s, but he's probably a little more well-known as the chairman of an investment bank, Wall Street, that no longer exists, Lehman Brothers. Yes, he was part of that credit default swap meltdown from last year. Thank you, John Lehman. Wonder what he's doing these days. That's beside the point. These 10 commissioners, though, didn't do the heavy lifting, to be honest. That was done by the staff, and Philip Zelikow in particular, the head of the staff. Philip Zelikow is a professor of history and political science at the University of Virginia, as fate would have it. The staff conducted thousands upon thousands of hours of interviews with hundreds and hundreds of witnesses. They dug through thousands of pounds of documents to piece together the story of what happened in the 1990s, and especially in the months, weeks, and days leading up to 9/11. In March of 2004, the 11 Commission held its public hearings. Called to testify were Secretaries of Defense under President Clinton and President Bush, William Cohen and Donald Rumsfeld. The Secretaries of State, Madeleine Albright, Colin Powell. The Director of Central Intelligence, George Tenet, a man who would later become infamous for declaring that it was a, quote, slam dunk that Saddam Hussein had a weapon of mass destruction. Also called to testify in closed-door session and not under oath were the two presidents. Bill Clinton testified on April 9th, 2004 for 4 hours. Closed-door session, not under oath. We don't have a transcript of that interview. President Bush was the last person to testify before the 9/11 Commission, and for quite a long time it seemed as though he might not actually testify, nor would Vice President Dick Cheney testify. But in the end, they both did, together, and like President Clinton, not under oath, and there is no transcript of their testimony. What we're going to watch now is President Bush's press conference given on the 29th of April 2004 after he'd been interviewed together with the Vice President Dick Cheney by members of the 9/11 Commission. Let's go to the tape.
The Vice President and I just finished a good conversation with the 911 Commission. It was wide-ranging. It was important. It was just a good discussion, and I really appreciate the members. I want to thank the Chairman and Vice Chairman for bring the Commission here and giving us a chance to share views on different subjects. And they had a lot of good questions, and I'm glad I did it. I'm glad I took the time. It's an important commission, and it's important that they ask the questions they ask so that they can help make recommendations necessary to better protect our homeland. I enjoyed it. Let me ask you a couple of questions.
President, what topic do you usually want to see spend most of the time on? And were there any subjects that you didn't answer or were advised by your counsel not to answer?
I was never advised by my counsel not to answer anything. I answered every question they asked. I'd probably best that I not go into the details of the conversation, let them incorporate into their report. There was a lot of interest, excuse me, a lot of interest in about how to better protect America. In other words, they're very interested in the recommendations that they're going to lay out, and I'm interested in those as well. And we discussed a lot of things, Terry, a lot of subjects, and it was a very cordial conversation. I was impressed by the questions, and it was I think it helped them understand how I think and how I run the White House and how we deal with threats. John.
President, you know, a lot of critics suggested that you wanted to appear jointly with the Vice President so that you two could keep your story straight or something.
Yeah.
Could you tell us what you think of the value of appearing together and how you would answer those critics?
Yeah, first of all, look, I mean, if we had something to hide, we wouldn't have met with them in the first place. We answered all their questions, and as I say, I think I came away good about the session because I wanted them to know, you know, how I set strategy, how we run the White House, how we deal with threats. The Vice President answered a lot of their questions. I answered all their questions. And I think it was important for them to see our body language as well, how we work together. But it was, you know, the commissioners will speak for themselves over time. They will let you know whether they thought fruitful series of discussions. I think they did. I think they found it to be useful. Yeah, Adam.
President,
yes.
Don't you think that the families deserve to have a transcript or to be able to see what you
Adam,
said?
you asked me that question yesterday. I got the same answer, yeah.
Can you say with any confidence that there are no al-Qaeda operatives active in the country today?
No, I can't say that. No, they didn't. But I'm not going to get any more details about what they asked me. I told you I wasn't going to get details about what they asked me, and then they just fell into your trap. But no, let me talk about vulnerabilities, and I got to get back to work. We are still vulnerable to attack, and the reason why is Al-Qaeda still exists. Al-Qaeda is dangerous. Al-Qaeda hates us, and we have to be correct 100% of the time in defending America, and they got to be right once. And therefore, we are vulnerable. But people need to know we're working. We, the government, at all levels, are working long hours to protect America. We're doing the best we can. The best way to secure America, however, is to stay on the offensive and bring those people to justice before they harm America again. And that's what we're continuing to do. But so long as there's an Al-Qaeda enemy that is willing to kill, we are vulnerable. Thank you all.
Some of the things we're going to be talking about. The World Trade Center attack, not in 2001, but rather in 1993 with a 1,500-pound truck bomb. Less than a dozen people were killed, more than 1,000 were injured. We didn't know it at the time, but this was perpetrated by nascent elements of Al-Qaeda. We're going to hear about the embassy bombings in Dar es Salaam and Nairobi, perpetrated also by Al-Qaeda. Bombings that 2 weeks later we responded to with cruise missile attacks on the Sudan and on Afghanistan in an attempt to destroy elements of the Al-Qaeda network and possibly to kill Osama bin Laden. However, at the time, August 1998, our attention, the American public's attention, was not on Nairobi and Kenya and the massive suicide bombings that killed hundreds of people. Rather, it was on a dress purchased from the Gap, which had been stained by President Clinton. Yes, this was the height of the Monica Lewinsky scandal. And many people in the media accused the Clinton administration of launching these cruise missile attacks against the Sudan and Afghanistan as a means to divert our attention from his sexual scandal. We're also going to hear about an attack on a United States destroyer, the USS Cole, while in port in Yemen, one of the countries on the southern border of Saudi Arabia, that happened just weeks before the 2000 election between George Bush and Al Gore. We're also going to hear about a failed terrorist attack, the so-called Millennium Plot. It's called Millennium Plot because it was broken up in the summer of 1999. Its goal was the destruction of Los Angeles International Airport. As I said, we're going to be hearing from two of these key witnesses here. 24th of March, Richard Clarke, counterterrorism czar, chief, administrator, whatever we want to call him, testified before the 9/11 Commission. His quote here sums up his opinion quite nicely. Although there were people in the FBI, CIA, Defense Department, State Department, and White House who worked very hard to destroy Al-Qaeda before it did catastrophic damage to the U.S., there were many others who found the prospect of significant Al-Qaeda attacks remote. In both CIA and the military, there was reluctance at senior career levels to utilize fully all the capabilities available. There was risk aversion. At the senior policy levels in the Clinton administration, there was an acute understanding of the terrorist threat, particularly Al-Qaeda. That understanding resulted in a vigorous program to counter Al-Qaeda, including lethal covert action, but it did not include a willingness to resume bombing Afghanistan, after the August 1998 cruise missile attack. The Bush administration saw terrorism policy as important, but not urgent, prior to 9/11. The difficulty in obtaining the first cabinet level, or principles, policy meeting on terrorism, and the limited principles involvement sent unfortunate signals to bureaucracy about the administration's attitude toward the Al-Qaeda threat. Principles is something we're going to hear a lot about. A principal is a cabinet-level secretary, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Attorney General. Each of these cabinet-level secretaries have a deputy, Secretary of State, deputy, Secretary of Defense, etc. So with that said, I'm going to turn the floor over now to Richard Clarke. What we're going to see first is a rather remarkable admission. Let's go to the tape.
I also welcome the hearings because it is finally a forum where I can apologize to the loved ones of the victims of 9/11, to them who are here in the room, to those who are watching on television. Your government failed you. Those entrusted with protecting you failed you. And I failed you. We tried hard, but that doesn't matter because we failed. And for that failure, I would ask, once all the facts are out, for your understanding and for your forgiveness. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll be glad to take your questions.
I want to know, first of all, was fighting Al-Qaeda a top priority for the Clinton administration from 1998 to the year 2001? How high of priority was it in that Clinton administration during that time period?
My impression was that fighting terrorism in general and fighting Al-Qaeda in particular were an extraordinarily high priority in the Clinton administration, certainly no higher priority. There were priorities probably of equal importance, such as the Middle East process, but I certainly don't know of one that was any higher in the priority of that administration.
With respect to the Bush administration, from the time they took office until September 11th, 2001, you had much to deal with: Russia, China, G8, Middle East. How high a priority was fighting Al-Qaeda in the Bush administration?
I believe the Bush administration in the first 8 months considered terrorism an important issue, but not an urgent issue. President Bush himself says as much in his interview with Bob Woodward in the book Bush at War. He said, "I didn't feel a sense of urgency." George Tenet and I tried very hard to create a sense of urgency by seeing to it that intelligence reports on the al-Qaeda threat were frequently given to the President and other high-level officials. And there was a process underway to address al-Qaeda. But although I continued to say it was an urgent problem, I don't think it was ever treated that way.
Now, you have said in many ways you've issued some blistering attacks on the Bush administration, but you've not held those criticisms from the Clinton administration either. We heard from Mr. Berger earlier that you were critical of the Clinton administration on two areas: not providing aid to the Northern Alliance and not going after the human conveyor belts of jihadists coming out of the sanctuaries in Afghanistan. Are there more in the Clinton administration years? The USS Cole, the response there?
Well, I think, first of all, Mr. Berger is right to say that almost everything I ever asked for in the way of support from him or from President Clinton, I got. We did enormously increase the counterterrorism budget of the federal government, initiated many programs, including what is now called Homeland Security. Mr. Berger is also right to note that I wanted a covert action program to aid Afghan factions to fight the Taliban, and that was not accomplished. He's also right to note that on several occasions, including after the attack on the Cole, I suggested that we bomb all of the Taliban and al-Qaeda infrastructure. Whether or not it would succeed in killing bin Laden, I thought that was the wrong way of looking at the problem. So I think the answer is essentially Mr. Berger got it right.
Okay.
I want to focus on the role of the National Security Advisor and your relationship with the National Security Advisor in the Clinton administration as compared with the Bush administration. Can you point to any similarities or differences?
Well, the similarity is that under all four National Security Advisors for whom I worked, I was told by each of the four, beginning with Brent Scowcroft, that if I ever had any, I hate to use the word, Senator, but actionable intelligence, the phrase, if I ever had reason to believe that there was something urgent that they could act on, that I could interrupt anything they were doing, that I had an open door at any time I needed it, day or night, if there was something about to happen. I think the difference between the two National Security Advisors in the Clinton administration and the National Security Advisor in the Bush administration is that on policy development, I dealt directly with the National Security Advisors in the Clinton administration, but policy development on counterterrorism, I was told, would be best done with the Deputy National Security Advisor. So I spent less time talking about the problems of terrorism with the National Security Advisor in this administration.
On January the 25th, seen a memo that you've written to Dr. Rice urgently asking for a principles review of al-Qaeda. You include helping the Northern Alliance, covert aid, significant new O2 budget authority to help fight al-Qaeda, and response to the USS Cole. You attached to this document both the Linda Plan of 1998 and a strategy paper from December 2000. Do you get a response to this urgent request for a principals meeting on these, and how does this affect your time frame for dealing with these important issues?
I did get a response. The response was that in the Bush administration, I should, and my committee, the Counterterrorism Security Group, should report to the Deputies Committee, which is a sub-cabinet level committee, and not to the principals. And that therefore it was inappropriate for me to be asking for a principals meeting. Instead, there would be a deputies meeting.
So does this slow the process down to go to the deputies rather than to the principals or a small group as you previously done?
It slowed it down enormously by months. First of all, the Deputies Committee didn't meet urgently in January or February. Then when the Deputies Committee did meet, it took the issue of Al-Qaeda as part of a cluster of policy issues, including nuclear proliferation in South Asia, democratization in Pakistan, how to treat the problems, the various problems, including narcotics and other problems in Afghanistan, and launched on a series of deputies meetings extending over several months to address Al-Qaeda in the context of all of those interrelated issues. That process probably ended, I think, in July of 2001. So we were ready for a principals meeting in July, but the principals' calendar was full, and then they went on vacation, many of them in August, so we couldn't meet in August, and therefore the principals met in September.
So as the Bush administration is carefully considering, from bottom up, a full review of fighting terrorism, what happens to these individual items, like a response to the USS Cole,
well,
flying the Predator? Why aren't these decided in a shorter time frame, as they're also going through a larger policy review of how this policy affects Pakistan and other countries? Important considerations, but why can't you do both?
The Deputies Committee, its chairman, Mr. Hadley, and others, thought that all of these issues were sufficiently interrelated that they should be taken up as a set of issues, and pieces of them should not be broken off.
Did you agree with that?
No, I didn't agree with much of that.
Assuming that the recommendations that you made on January 25th of 2001, based on Linda, based on Blue Sky, including aid to the Northern Alliance, which had been an agenda item at this point for 2.5 years without any action. Assuming that there had been more Predator reconnaissance missions, and assuming that that had all been adopted, say, on January 26th, year 2001, is there the remotest chance that it would have prevented 9/11?
No.
It just would have allowed our response after 9/11 to be perhaps a little bit faster.
Well, the response would have begun before 9/11.
But, yes, but we weren't going to, there was no recommendation on your part or anyone else's part that we declare war and attempt to invade Afghanistan prior to 9/11.
That's right.
Were you frustrated by this process?
I was sufficiently frustrated that I asked to be reassigned.
When was this?
Probably May or June, certainly no later than June. And there was agreement in that time frame, in the May or June time frame, that I would be, my request would be honored, and I would be reassigned on the 1st of October to a new position to deal with cybersecurity, a position that I requested be created.
So you're saying that the frustration got to a high enough level that it wasn't your portfolio, it wasn't doing a lot of things at the same time, it was that you weren't getting fast enough action on what you were requesting?
That's right. My view was that this administration, while it listened to me, didn't either believe me that there was an urgent problem or was unprepared to act as though there was an urgent problem. And I thought, if the administration doesn't believe its national coordinator for counterterrorism when he says there's an urgent problem, and if it's unprepared to act as though there's an urgent problem, then probably I should get another job. I thought cybersecurity was, and I still think cybersecurity is an extraordinarily important issue for which this country is very underprepared. And I thought perhaps I could make a contribution if I worked full-time on that issue.
You then write a letter or a memo on September the 4th to Dr. Rice expressing some of these frustrations several months later, if you say the time frame is May or June, when you decided to resign. A memo comes out that we have seen on September the 4th. You are blunt and blasting DOD for not willingly using the force and the power. You blast the CIA for being predator. You urge policymakers to imagine a day after hundreds of Americans lay dead in a home or abroad after a terrorist attack and ask themselves what else they could have done. You write this on September the 4th, 7 days before September 11th.
That's right.
What else could have been done, Mr. Clarke?
Well, all of the things that we recommended in the plan or strategy, there's a lot of debate about whether it's a plan or a strategy or a series of options, but all of the things we recommended back in January were those things on the table in September. They were done. They were done after September 11th. They were all done. I didn't really understand why they couldn't have been done in February.
Well, let's say, Mr. Clarke, I think this is a fair question. Let's say you asked to brief the President of the United States on counterterrorism. Mm-hmm. Did you ask that?
I asked for a series of briefings on the issues in my portfolio, including counterterrorism and cybersecurity.
Did you get that request?
I did. I was given a briefing opportunity to brief on cybersecurity in June. I was told I could brief the President on terrorism after this policy development process was complete and had the principals meeting and a draft national security policy decision that had been approved by the Deputies Committee.
And let's imagine that instead of saying no, you asked for this briefing to the President. You said you didn't get it after 8 months of talking. Let's say you get this briefing in February after your memo to Dr. Rice on September the 25th. Mm-hmm. And you meet with the President of the United States in February, and you brief him on terrorism. Tell me how you convince the President to move forward on this and get this principals meeting that doesn't take place until September the 4th moved up so that you can do something about this problem.
Well, I think the best thing to have done, if there had been a meeting with the President in February, was to show him the accumulated intelligence that al-Qaeda was strong and was planning attacks against the United States, against friendly governments. It was possible to make a very persuasive case that this was a major threat and this was an urgent problem.
And you think this would have sped up the deputies process and the principals process?
Well,
do you think the President would have reached down then and said something to the national security team to
I don't know.
expedite this? What
No.
You worked for President Clinton. You saw what meetings with presidents could do there. Is this a magical solution, or is it something that presidents might say right back to you, listen, Dick, I've got many other things I've got to do here in the Middle East peace process, Bosnia, Kosovo, the Korean Peninsula. How likely is it that we are able to see some kind of result from a meeting like that?
I think it depends in part on the President. President Bush was regularly told by the Director of Central Intelligence that there was an urgent threat. On one occasion, he was told this dozens of times in the morning briefings that George Tenet gave him. On one of those occasions, he asked for a strategy and to deal with the threat. Condi Rice came back from that meeting, called me, and relayed what the President had requested. And I said, well, you know, we've had this strategy ready since before you were inaugurated. I showed it to you. You have the paperwork. We can have a meeting on the strategy anytime you want. She said she would look into it. Her looking into it and the President asking for it did not change the pace at which it was considered. And as far as I know, the President never asked again. At least I was never informed that he asked again. I do know he was thereafter continually informed about the threat by George Tenet. I would like to think that had I been informed by the FBI that 2 senior al-Qaeda operatives who had been in a planning meeting earlier in Kuala Lumpur were now in the United States, and we knew that, and we knew their names, and I think we even had their pictures, I would like to think that I would have released, or would have had the FBI release, a press release with their names, with their descriptions, held a press conference, tried to get their names and pictures on the front page of every paper, America's Most Wanted, the Evening News, and caused a successful nationwide manhunt for those two of the 19 hijackers. But I don't know, because you're asking me a hypothetical, and I have the benefit now of 20/20 hindsight.
With respect to the level of threat and the intelligence information that you were receiving, is it fair to say that in the summer of 2001, the threat level either approached or exceeded anything that you had previously been receiving?
Well, I think it exceeded anything that George Tenet or I had ever seen.
And I think the phrase which has received some currency in our hearings of someone's hair being on fire originated with you, saying that basically you knew that something drastic was about to happen and that the indicators were all consistent in that regard.
That's right.
Did you make a determination that the threat was going to come from abroad as an exclusive proposition, or did you understand that given the fact that we had been attacked before and that plans had been interrupted to attack us before, that the potential existed for al-Qaeda to strike at us on our homeland?
The CIA said in their assessments that the attack would most likely occur overseas, most probably in Saudi Arabia, possibly in Israel. I thought, however, that it might well take place in the United States based on what we had learned in December '99 when we rolled up operations in Washington State, in Brooklyn, in Boston. The fact that we didn't have intelligence that we could point to that said it would take place in the United States wasn't significant in my view, because frankly, sir, I know how this is going to sound, but I have to say it, I didn't think the FBI would know whether or not there was anything going on in the United States by al-Qaeda.
Well, the FBI was the principal agency upon which you had to rely. Is that not the case?
It is.
Now, with respect to what you were told, you were the principal coordinator for counterterrorism for the chief executive flowing up and down through you, correct?
Yes, sir.
Did you know that the 2 individuals who had been identified as al-Qaeda had entered the United States and were presently thought to be in the country?
I was not informed of that, nor were senior levels of the FBI.
Had you known that these individuals were in the country, what steps, with the benefit of hindsight, but informed hindsight, would you have taken given the level of threat?
To put the answer in a context, I had been saying to the FBI and to the other federal law enforcement agencies and to the CIA that because of this intelligence that something was about to happen, that they should lower their threshold of reporting, that they should tell us anything that looked the slightest bit unusual. In retrospect, having said that over and over again to them, for them to have had this information somewhere in the FBI and not told me, I still find absolutely incomprehensible.
Was the information with respect to Moussaoui and his erratic behavior in flight school ever communicated to you?
Not to me.
And given the fact that there was a body of information with respect to the use of planes as weapons in the intelligence community's knowledge, had you received information about Moussaoui training to fly a commercial airplane, would that have had some impact on the kind of efforts which might be made to protect commercial aviation?
I don't know. The information to which you refer, information in the intelligence community's knowledge about Al-Qaeda having thought of using aircraft as weapons, that information was old, relatively speaking, 5 years, 6 years old. Hadn't reoccurred, to my knowledge, during those 5 or 6 years. And has to be placed, to give the intelligence community a break, it has to be placed in the context of the other intelligence reports. The volume of intelligence reports on this kind of thing, on Al-Qaeda threats and other terrorist threats, was in the tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands over the course of the 5 or 6 years. Now, in retrospect, to go back and find a report 6 years earlier that said perhaps they were going to use aircraft as weapons, it's easy to do now, but I think the intelligence community analysts can be forgiven for not thinking about it, given the fact that they hadn't seen a lot in the 5 or 6 years intervening about it, and that there were so many reports about so many other things.
And yet an FAA advisory went out. The FAA advised on the potential for domestic hijackings.
I asked them to.
And had you known on top of that that there was a jihadist who was identified, apprehended in the United States before 9/11, who was in flight school, acting erratically.
I would like to think, sir, that even without the benefit of 20/20 hindsight, I could have connected those dots.
Thank you.
Let me ask you, just specific to the use of airplanes as a weapon, because it seems so obvious, and again, it seemed obvious. Fully disclosed, it seemed so obvious after the fact. I mean, it was such a simple and easy strategy that was put in place. But in your case, in '96 with the Olympics, you raised a concern about a small Cessna being used to attack the Olympics in Atlanta. During the Millennium Scare as well, you sent a memo to Berger discussing the possible domestic threats, and the quote is that, is there a threat to civilian aircraft? In March 2001, another CSG item on the agenda mentions a possibility of alleged bin Laden interest in targeting U.S. passenger planes at the Chicago airport, end of quote. I mean, if you listen and look at the documents on the day of 9/11, it just inescapably leads to the conclusion that we were surprised by hijacking.
Well, Senator, I would distinguish between hijackings in general and hijackings that then turn the aircraft into suicide weapons. Been hijackings by terrorists going back for 20, 25 years. And the United States had some programs in place to deal with that. In 1996, after the TWA 800 crash, the President appointed a commission on aircraft safety and security that looked at whether we needed to augment our protection against hijacking. And it made several recommendations. Most of those recommendations were carried out, not all of them. One of the things it rejected was federalizing the aircraft searching process that is now done by the Transportation Security Agency, because it would have cost so much money and it would have required such a big federal bureaucracy. At the time, when there had been no recent hijacking, I assume that commissioners on that commission thought they were making the right recommendation. Many of their recommendations for increased security, however, were carried out. But as to your question about using aircraft as weapons, I was afraid, beginning in 1996, not that a Cessna would fly into the Olympics, but that any size aircraft would be put into the Olympics. And during my inspection of the Atlanta security arrangements a month or two before the Games, I was shocked that the FBI hadn't put into effect any aircraft air defense security arrangements. So I threw together an air defense for the Atlanta Games somewhat quickly. quickly, but I got an air defense system in place. We then tried to institutionalize that for Washington to protect the Capitol and the White House. And that system would have been run by the Secret Service. It would have involved missiles, anti-aircraft guns, radar, helicopters. Secret Service developed all the plans for that. Secret Service was a big advocate for it, but they were unable to get the Treasury Department, in which they were then located, to approve it. And I was unable to get the Office of Management and Budget to fund it.
Richard Clarke testified in open session under oath for some 2 hours. So on 24 March 2004, the committee really wanted to talk to Condoleezza Rice. It wasn't until the end of March that the Bush administration allowed her participation before the commission, and on the 8th of April 2004, she testified in open session under oath for 3 hours. Let's go to the tape.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rice. Appreciate your statement, your attendance, and your service. I have a couple questions. As we understand it, when you first came into office, you've just been through a very difficult campaign. In that campaign, neither the president nor his opponent, at the best of my knowledge, ever mentioned al-Qaeda. There had been almost no congressional action or hearings about al-Qaeda. Very little bit in the newspapers, and yet you walk in and Dick Clarke is talking about al-Qaeda should be our number one priority. Sandy Berger tells you you'll be spending more time on that than anything else. What did you think, and what did you tell the president as you hit that kind of, I suppose, new information for you?
Well, in fact, Mr. Chairman, it was not new information. I think we all knew about the 1998 bombings. We knew that there was speculation that the 2000 Cole attack was al-Qaeda. There had been, I think, documentaries about Osama bin Laden. I myself had written for an introduction to a volume on bioterrorism done at Stanford that I thought that we wanted not to wake up one day and find that Osama bin Laden had succeeded on our soil. It was on the radar screen of any person who studied or worked in the international security field. But there's no doubt that I think the briefing by Dick Clarke, the earlier briefing during the transition by Director Tenet, and of course what we talked with about Sandy Berger, it gave you a high sense of the problem and a sense that this was something that the United States had to deal with. I have to say that, of course, there were other priorities, and indeed in the briefings with the Clinton administration they emphasized other priorities. North Korea, the Middle East, the Balkans. One doesn't have the luxury of dealing only with one issue if you are the United States of America. There are many urgent and important issues. But we all had a strong sense that this was a very crucial issue. The question was, what do you then do about it? And the decision that we made was to, first of all, have no drop-off in what the Clinton administration was doing, because clearly they had done a lot of work to deal with this very important priority. And so we kept the counterterrorism team on board. We knew that George Tenet was there. We had the comfort of knowing that Louis Freeh was there. And then we set out. I talked to Dick Clarke almost immediately after his, or if I say shortly after his memo to me saying that al-Qaeda was a major threat. We set out to try and craft a better strategy, but we were quite cognizant of this group, of the fact that something had to be done. I do think early on in these discussions we asked a lot of questions about whether Osama bin Laden himself ought to be so much the target of interest, or what was that going to do to organization if in fact he was put out of commission. And I remember very well the director saying to President Bush, well, it would help, but it would not stop attacks by al-Qaeda nor destroy the network.
You've used the phrase a number of times, and I'm hoping with my question to disabuse you of using it in the future. You said the president was tired of swatting flies. Can you tell me one example where the president swatted a fly when it came to al-Qaeda? Prior to 9/11?
I think what the president was speaking to
was... What fly had he swatted?
Well, the disruptions abroad was what he was really focusing on. When the
No.
CIA would go after Abu
He hadn't
Zubaydah,
swatted-
go after this guy, and
Dr. Rice, we didn't.
that was
We
what
only
was meant.
swatted a fly once on the 20th of August, 1998. We didn't swat any flies afterwards. How the hell could he be tired?
We swatted at. I think he felt that what the AC was doing was going after individual terrorists here and there, and that's what he meant by swatting flies. It was simply a figure of speech.
Well, I think it's an unfortunate figure of speech because I think, especially after the attack on the Cole of the 12th of October 2000, it would not have been a swatting of fly. It would not have been. We did not wait to get a need to wait to get a strategic plan. Dick Clarke had in his memo on the 25th of January overt military operations. As a part, he turned that memo around in 24 hours, Dr. Clarke. There were a lot of plans in place in the Clinton administration, military plans in the Clinton administration. In fact, just since we're in the mood to declassify stuff, there was he included in his January 25th memo 2 appendixes. Appendix A, strategy for the elimination of the jihadist threat of Al-Qaeda. Appendix B, political military plan for Al-Qaeda. Why didn't we respond to the Cole?
Well,
why didn't we swat that fly?
I believe that the question of whether or not you respond in a tactical sense or whether you respond in a strategic sense, whether or not you decide that you're going to respond to every attack with minimal use of military force and go after and on a kind of tit-for-tat basis. By the way, in that memo, Dick Clarke talks about not doing this tit-for-tat, doing this on a time of our choosing. I'm aware, Mr. Kerry, of a speech that you gave at that time that said that perhaps the best thing that we could do to respond to the Cole and to the memories was to do something about the threat of Saddam Hussein. That's a strategic view, and we took a strategic view. We didn't take a tactical view. I mean, it was really, quite frankly, I was blown away when I read the speech because it's a brilliant speech. It talks about really an asymmetric
I presume you read it the last few days?
Oh, no, I read it quite a bit before that. It's an asymmetric approach. Now, you can decide that every time Al-Qaeda does something...
You're saying that you didn't have a military response against the Cole because of my speech?
I'm saying...
that had I not given that speech, you would have attacked him?
No, I'm just saying that I think it was a brilliant way to think about it. It was a way of thinking about it strategically, not tactically. But if I may answer the question that you've asked me, the issue of whether to respond, how to respond to the Cole, I think Don Rumsfeld has also talked about this. Yes, the Cole had happened. We received, I think, on January 25th, the same assessment, or roughly the same assessment of who was responsible for the Cole that Sandy Berger talked to you about. It was preliminary. It was not clear. But that was not the reason that we felt that we did not want to, quote, respond to the Cole. We knew that the options that had been employed by the Clinton administration had been standoff options. The President had missile strikes, or perhaps bombers would have been possible, long-range bombers, although getting in place the apparatus to use long-range bombers is even a matter of whether you have basing in the region. We knew that Osama bin Laden had been, in something that was provided to me, bragging that he was going to withstand any response, and then he was going to emerge and come out stronger.
But you're figuring this out to give a very long answer.
We simply believed that the best approach was to put in place a plan that was going to eliminate this threat, not respond to it
Dr. Clarke, look, I may say, I think you could come in there if you said, look, we screwed up. We made a lot of mistakes. I mean, you obviously don't want to use the M word in here. And I would say, fine, it's game, set, and match. I understand that. I mean, but this strategic and tactical.
I do not believe to this day that it would have been a good thing to respond to the Cole given the kinds of options that we were going to have. And with all due respect to Dick Clarke, if you're speaking about the Delinda plan, my understanding is it was never adopted, and that Dick Clarke himself has said that the military portion of this was not taken up by the Clinton administration.
Let me move into another area.
So we were not presented, I just want to be very clear on this because it's been a source of controversy. We were not presented with a plan.
Well, that's not true.
We were presented with
I've heard you say that, Dr. Clarke. If that 25 January 2001 memo was declassified, I don't believe...
That January 25 memo, has a series of actionable items having to do with Uzbekistan, Northern
move
Alliance.
to another area.
May I finish answering your question, though, because this is an important point.
I know it's important. Everything that's going on here is important.
Since we have a point of disagreement, I'd like to have a chance to address it.
No. Actually, we have many points of disagreement, Dr. Clarke. We'll have a chance to do in closed session. You can't. Please don't filibuster me. It's not fair. It is not fair. I have been polite. I have been courteous. It is not fair to me. I understand that we have a disagreement.
Commissioner, I'm here to answer questions, and you've asked me a question, and I'd like to have...
I want to ask you some questions about the August 6, 2001 PDB. We had been advised in writing by the CIA on March 19, 2004, that the August 6 PDB was prepared and self-generated by a CIA employee. Following Director Tennett's testimony on March 26 before us, the CIA clarified its version of events, saying that questions by the President prompted them to prepare the August 6 PDB. You have said to us in our meeting together earlier in February that the President directed the CIA to prepare the August 6 PDB. Extraordinary high terrorist attack threat level in the summer of 2001 is well documented. And Richard Clarke's testimony about the possibility of an attack against the United States homeland was repeatedly discussed from May to August within the intelligence community, and that is well documented. You acknowledged to us in your interview of February 7, 2004, that Richard Clarke told you that al-Qaeda cells were in the United States. Did you tell the President at any time prior to August 6 of the existence of al-Qaeda cells in the United States?
First, let me just make certain...
If you could just answer that question, because I only have a very limited...
I understand, Commissioner, but it's
important
that I also address... It's also important, Commissioner, that I address the other issues that you have raised. So I will do it quickly, but if you'll just give me a moment.
Well, my only question to you is whether you told the President...
If you'll just give me a moment, I will address fully the questions that you've asked. First of all, yes, the August 6th PDB was in response to questions of the President. In that sense, he asked that this be done. It was not a particular threat report. And there was historical information in there about various aspects of al-Qaeda's operations. Dick Clarke had told me, I think in a memorandum, I remember it as being only a line or two, that there were al-Qaeda cells in the United States. Now, the question is, what did we need to do about that? And I also understood that that was what the FBI was doing, that the FBI was pursuing these al-Qaeda cells. I believe in the August 6th memorandum it says that there were 70 full field investigations underway of these cells. And so there was no recommendation that we do something about this. The FBI was pursuing it. I really don't remember, Commissioner, whether I discussed this with the President.
Thank you.
Remember very well that the President was aware that there were issues inside the United States. He talked to people about this, but I don't remember the al-Qaeda cells as being something that we were told we needed to do something about.
Isn't it a fact, Dr. Rice, that the August 6 PDB warned against possible attacks in this country? And I ask you whether you recall the title of that PDB.
I believe the title was Bin Laden Determined to Attack Inside the United States. Now, the PDB, no, Mr. Benveniste,
I will get into the...
I would like to finish my point here.
I didn't know there was a point.
Given that you asked me whether or not it warned of attacks.
I asked you what the title was.
You said, did it not warn of attacks? It did not warn of attacks inside the United States. It was historical information based on old reporting. There was no new threat information, and it did not, in fact, warn of any coming attacks inside the United States.
Now, you knew by August 2001 of al-Qaeda involvement in the first World Trade Center bombing. Is that correct? You knew that in 1999, late 99, in the Millennium Threat period, that we had thwarted an al-Qaeda attempt to blow up Los Angeles International Airport and thwarted cells operating in Brooklyn, New York, and Boston, Massachusetts. As of the August 6th briefing, you learned that al-Qaeda members have resided or traveled to the United States for years and maintained a support system in the United States. And you learned that FBI information since the 1998 blind shake warning of hijackings to free the blind shake indicated a pattern of suspicious activity in the country up until August 6th, consistent with preparation for hijackings. Isn't that so?
Do you have other questions that you want me to answer as part of the sequence?
Did you not have indicated here that this was some historical document? And I am asking you whether it is not the case that you learned in the PDB memo of August 6th that the FBI was saying that it had information suggesting that preparations, not historically, but ongoing, along with these numerous full-field investigations against al-Qaeda cells, that preparations were being made consistent with hijackings within the United States?
What the August 6th PDB said, and perhaps I should read it to you.
We would be happy to have it declassified in full at this time, putting its title.
I believe, Mr. Benveniste, that you've had access to this PDB.
But we have not had it declassified so that it can be shown publicly.
I believe you've had access to this PDB, exceptional access. But let me address your question.
Nor could we, prior to today, reveal the title of that PDB.
May I address the question, sir? The fact is that this August 6th PDB was in response to the President's questions about whether or not something might happen or something might be planned by al-Qaeda inside the United States. He asked because all of the threat reporting, or the threat reporting that was actionable, was about the threats abroad, not about the United States. This particular PDB had a long section on what bin Laden had wanted to do, speculative much of it, in 97, 98, that he had in fact liked the results of the 1993 bombing. It had a number of discussions of, it had a discussion of whether or not they might hijacking to try and free a prisoner who was being held in the United States, Rassam. It reported that the FBI had full field investigations underway. And we checked on the issue of whether or not there was something going on with surveillance of buildings, and we were told, I believe, that the issue was the courthouse in which this might take place. There was nothing in this memo that suggested that an attack was coming on New York or Washington, D.C. There was nothing in this memo as to time, place, how, or where. This was not a threat report to the President or a threat report to me.
We agree that there were no specifics. The President was in Crawford, Texas at the time he received the PDB. You were not with him, correct?
That's correct.
Now, was the President, in words or substance, alarmed in any way or motivated to take any action, such as meeting with the Director of the FBI, meeting with the Attorney General, as a result of receiving the information contained in the PDB?
I want to repeat that when this document was presented, it was presented as, yes, there were some frightening things. And by the way, I was not at Crawford, but the President and I were in contact, and I might have even been, though I can't remember, with him by video link during that time. The President was told, this is historical information. I'm told he was told this is historical information.
What Richard Benveniste was talking about there is what we have partially on the screen here, the August 6th, 2001 PDB, or President's Daily Brief. It's a remarkable document, though just a page and a half long. As we can see quite clearly, we had some idea that something was going to happen. We were caught off guard not because there was no one ringing the alarm bell. We were caught off guard because there was no one listening for that alarm bell. When the Commission finished on the 21st of August, 2004, they issued their report. Several hundred pages long. What we have here is the executive summary. Two sides to the equation: failures and recommendations. On the side of failures, excuse me. Number 1, CIA HUMINT, Central Intelligence Agency Human Intelligence. A breakdown in our human intelligence gathering ability, in no small part because of backlash against covert actions taken by the CIA in the 1960s and the 1970s, and the hearings that were held before Congress in the late 1970s on this subject. It's what Richard Clarke called a risk-averse climate. Number 2, DoD unengaged, Department of Defense unengaged. According to the report, the Department of Defense was still essentially on a Cold War footing, with its eyes not on non-state actors, but rather on major state players like Russia. And at the moment this happened, no one really remembers this, but we had quite a little row with China going over a downed American, what they were calling spy plane, in Chinese territorial waters, and the Chinese were holding the members of the crew as possible spies. Number 3, NORAD, Strategic Air Command, the people tasked during the Cold War with manning and in unthinkable situations, launching our intercontinental ballistic missiles. NORAD looked outward. The radars were not turned inward to see things like these planes going off course inside the boundaries of the continental United States. Number 4, the FBI overmatched to the task. According to the report, the FBI simply did not have manpower, and on the other hand, a focus on terrorism as an international problem. Number 5 is related to that. FBI, quote, geared towards prosecution. One of the major findings of this commission was that the Clinton administration had approached the problem of terrorism from what could be a law enforcement angle. If you're looking to prosecute someone, you're looking to gather evidence. You maybe are even looking to allow them to perpetrate part or all of their crime before you arrest them. Of course, that's not necessarily possible when that crime would involve mass murder. Number 6, FAA unprepared for suicide hijacking. We've seen hijackings in this class. Entebbe in 1976, the People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a member militia of the PLO, hijacked that Air France flight and flew it to Entebbe, Uganda. They didn't fly that plane into a building. Nothing like this had ever happened before, quite frankly. And though, as we've saw in these clips in the testimony, that the concept had popped up in the intelligence committee from time to time, it was hardly number 1 on the list of probable outcomes from a hijacking. And so, when the planes were hijacked, there was not a thought process of, we need to bring them down. Number 7, failed diplomacy. This is in regards to Afghanistan, in regards to the Taliban. The Taliban had been in power since 1996, and Al-Qaeda had been there the entire time. Of course, Al-Qaeda had been there the entire time because bin Laden and members of that organization had been in Afghanistan since the Soviet invasion, all the way back in the late 1980s. Failed diplomacy that allowed Al-Qaeda to have that safe haven and that training ground in Afghanistan. And finally, great permeable borders. I think this one goes without saying. We had 19 hijackers here in the United States, all of them here on false pretenses, some of them here outstaying visas, overstaying visas, and so we had a breakdown of the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, something that no longer exists, actually. Its functions being wrapped up into the Department of Homeland Security. On the other side of the equation, we have the recommendations. 3 in number. The first is self-evident and hardly required the massive research effort and report to come to this conclusion, but it is important nonetheless. Attack terrorists and sponsors, such as Afghanistan, the Taliban, and of course the people they're hiding, Al-Qaeda. Of course, we would actually attack terrorists and their sponsors. That would involve Saudi Arabia, because unfortunately a lot of Saudi money is behind groups like Al-Qaeda. After all, bin Laden is a Saudi, and 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi. Saudi money builds the radical madrasas in Pakistan, in which many members of the Taliban were trained. After all, what is the word Taliban? It's the students of Islamic knowledge, as we learned in the last lecture. Number 2, win the war of ideas. This one's important. This one's extraordinarily important. This report argues that the battle we are waging is not a military one. It's an ideological one. And an ideological war cannot be won with bombs, guns, and planes. In some respects, it's like the Cold War. Kids in Moscow wanted to wear Levi's, they wanted to drink Coca-Cola, and they wanted to listen to Van Halen. Kids in New York did not want to wear a babushka, they did not want to work on a collective farm, and they did not listen to, I don't even know, a band from the Soviet Union. Fill in the blank. We won the war of ideas in the Cold War. Our system was more attractive, and our system won. Some people say we won the Cold War because we outspent the Soviets on military equipment. That's part of the equation, to be sure. But it's not the entire story. It's a story about an ideological struggle between a free and open society and a planned, centralized society. And we won. And this war is going to be the same thing. It's a war of ideas. And our system needs to be attractive. And our system needs to be the one that the rest of the world wants to emulate. And that's how we will defeat Al-Qaeda and groups like them. And finally, number 3 is again a bit of a no-duh. Prepare for another attack. There's not been another attack on the American homeland. However, since 2001, there have been many, many attacks overseas, carried out by Al-Qaeda, and of course, thousands, if not tens of thousands of attacks carried out on American soldiers by Al-Qaeda in Iraq between 2003 and 2007.